Morning, everybody. So I have two goals today, kind of in our time together. The first is transitioning us out of the last 4 weeks of deconstruction and the topics that we've been talking about, which have been really amazing, and also to introduce kind of our next topic for the next few weeks together. But I wanted to start with a story. A few months ago, Bree and I went to Boston for a wedding. While she was carrying out all her bridesmaids' duties, I drove into the city, parked my car, and retraced a walk I had taken every Friday night my freshman year of college, from the bus stop in Harvard Square down Mass Ave to MIT, where we had our Friday night college devotionals. On this day, I finished my walk at a bench along the Charles River, overlooking the city, and just took time to pray, write in my journal, and ponder not just the 10 years that had gone by since I was there, but also the 40 years since my parents became Christians there. I was brought to tears thinking about how God had used this city and the people in it to give me the life and the family that I have now. I sat there and thought about what it would be like to sit on that bench with my 18-year-old self, like Harold, and tell him all about the adventures and terrains we would journey through for the next decade. To show him pictures of his future daughter and his wife and community, he'd be blown away. You ever have those moments where you return after some time to ordinary yet special places and are humbled by where God has taken you? What makes those places so special is that it brings to mind all those terrains on our map that Jeff mentioned last week. All those points in our journey where in the moment where we were overwhelmed by the new storms, the new challenges, the unexpected twists and turns. But now we look back with gratitude, seeing how God came through, how he walked with us. He gave us what we needed. He stayed faithful to his promises. I wonder if the beach of the Sea of Galilee became that kind of place for Peter. I wonder if there were moments he returned to those shores and pondered all the memories on that beach growing up there as a kid, messing around with his brother Andrew, learning the basics of the fisherman trade from his father. As he grew older, experiencing those common, boring, laborious feelings of another day at the office. I wonder if he ever returned and thought about the time when an interesting new teacher named Jesus asked to use his boat to teach, and then rolled his eyes when his teacher asked him to let his nets down just one more time for a catch, only to be almost capsized by an enormous haul of fish in his nets. I wonder if he recalled the day he heard those three words, "Come, follow me," and dropped all those nets to follow this Jesus. Or if he stood on the shore and looked out to the place where he walked on water for a few moments. Or the time when he thought he was going to die in a storm, only to watch the storm quiet down in submission to the words of his new mentor. I wonder if he could smell the fish cooking on the fire as he remembered a talk with the resurrected Jesus on the beach after publicly disowning him and betraying him, only to have his master and friend come back, look him in the eyes, and renew his love for him. We could go on and on with all of Peter's moments, couldn't we? Has there ever been anyone that's gone through more deconstruction and then reconstruction moments than Peter? I mean, Jesus came out from the jump and reconstructed this guy's name. Said, "You're no longer Simon, you're Peter." And he says, "On this rock I will build my church, but also get behind me, Satan, because you don't get it." The transfiguration, cutting a guy's ear off, preaching the first ever Christian sermon, and starting the church, being called out by Paul for being racist. I mean, Peter went through it all. We've been talking about deconstructions in church these last 4 weeks, which has been awesome. We talked about 7 types of deconstruction. You can go back and look at some of those incredible teachings from the last 4 weeks. One of the big takeaways for me is that if we are really walking with Jesus, it means we're probably going to be deconstructing and reconstructing constantly. Just like Peter, we will go through that process in a variety of ways, in a variety of seasons. One of the moments in my life that has stuck out to me in that area was right before my freshman year in college. I grew up in this family of churches. My parents were ministers at our sister church in San Diego. While I was in middle school, my parents transitioned out of the ministry, and we made the cross-country road trip from California to move to Connecticut to be closer to family. Within 10 days of our move, because of some differing expectations between my dad and his new corporate boss, he was let go. And now, after moving his family across the country and days away from school starting for my sister and I, he found himself without a job. So where do you turn in those moments? When life gets crazy, when you've totally been disoriented and disillusioned by what you thought was supposed to happen. You turn to where many of us turn in those moments, to Starbucks. For a couple of years, my dad was up at 4 a.m. with his green apron on, working under a 25-year-old boss and serving a lot of hurried people demanding their grande, non-fat, sugar-free vanilla soy lattes. The closest church at that time was about an hour and a half away, so there were many Sundays for several years where we couldn't make it to church because my dad had to work to be able to get 40 hours needed just to give our family benefits. But every week, my parents would gather the four of us together in our living room to remember Jesus and take communion together. Most mornings, I could find my mom in the breakfast nook, scribbling in her journal and reading her Bible before she left for her 2 jobs. I would watch my dad come home from work and kiss my mom, and then set aside time every week to get some quality time with my sister and I. And then many nights, I would watch as my dad put on his jacket, slipped out of the house to go talk and pray with his father. You know, after those years, my dad was able to find some other work. We were able to get more plugged in with the church. But it was during those hard years for my parents that I fell in love with Jesus and decided to follow him. Seeing their strength and their resilience as they came upon some new terrain on their map to God taught me so much. And it was awesome because we went back to that town to show my wife Bree where I grew up. As we drove around, my dad pointed out, I prayed there and cried to God there and was on my knees there and yelled at God there. And it's so meaningful to look back at moments to where life wasn't fair, yet you see how God was faithful. But I'll never forget, before my freshman year in college, I was at a camp. A new friend who I just met came up to me and asked, "Hey, Nick, what was it like when your parents fell away and you helped to bring them back?" And in that moment, I was pretty shocked, because what I had witnessed from my parents was that they drew even nearer to God during those times, not further away. And it made me realize, there are certain boxes and labels that it's easy to put on people based off of our certain traditions and cultures. And it disoriented me a little bit, but it taught me a lot. And it taught me that we have to be really careful when we start labeling people without knowing their story or situation. To label someone as weak or strong or fallen away, I think to label someone as weak or strong or fallen away or struggling or doing well spiritually or prideful when we don't know their full story can be dangerous and often a failed attempt at loving our neighbor as ourselves. And that's where deconstruction is so necessary. Taking unhealthy ways of thinking and making them healthy. Taking traditions you might have held on to for so long, but realizing that there are different ways of thinking. Enduring and trusting even when things are hard, scary, and unfair. I think that's what Peter did. He had so many moments of unlearning traditions he had held on to, or persevering through misunderstanding, or getting up even when he made mistakes. What makes Peter so inspiring is not his perfection, but is his willingness to stay engaged. And I think when we wrestle with certain things, sometimes temptation creeps in to start holding people at an arm's distance and to start disengaging. We had our family group over our home this last week to talk about some of these things we've been talking about on Sundays. And one of the questions that was asked was, hey, what helps you when in those moments where you're deconstructing? And my sister spoke up and said that the one word she thinks of in those times is the word engage. She talked about not buying into the temptation to isolate or back away or give up, but to stay engaged, learn how to persevere, and then reconstruct on the right things. Because there's a quote that says, deconstruction without reconstruction ends in destruction. And as we rethink things, it's so important to replace the unhealthy with the good. During that same family group, Kyle Malden shared that he likes the word renovation more than deconstruction. because it implies that we tear down with the goal of replacing it with something better and more valuable. So it should give us a lot of hope in those times that what comes out of times of wrestling is going to be purer and a more faithful, a more valuable faith that has been refined and renovated to become better. My wife likes to say that she loves that the word rest is in wrestle. Even in our wrestling, we can settle into it, knowing that if we lean into it, we'll find God. And what I've experienced is that whenever I've been struggling through things or questioning things or doubting things, my only hope is to come back to Jesus. When I'm being tossed back and forth by the waves and feel like the current is drifting me away, I need to make sure that I am tethered to the anchor that is Jesus. And I have found for me in my own life that whenever I go back to him, I feel more at peace. I may not have all the answers. My circumstances may not have changed. I may not have, to be able to see everything clearly, but Jesus becomes the lighthouse in the darkness that is bringing me back home. And honestly, it breaks my heart when I see people deconstruct, but in the process, lose Jesus. Because I deeply care about and agree with rethinking our traditions, the ways we've been treated, unhealthy dynamics in the church, and a shifting perspective on the ways we've read and interpreted certain scriptures, discussing doubts that we carry, but we can't lose Jesus. He's the only hope, that this world has. He's still the only thing that makes sense in this crazy, confusing world. And what I don't mean is just get back to following Jesus. Or, hey, don't worry about your feelings. Just do what Jesus says. Just put that stuff to the side. Stop deconstruction. Just keep following Jesus. What I mean is that whenever I've gone through hard things or questioned things, there becomes a moment when I have to choose to trust that he is for me. That he is in my corner. When I choose to trust that, it creates the space for me to really learn from him. And also to learn a lot about myself. And I tend to come back from those moments even stronger and more at peace. And that's not just one time. That's a constant practice I need to engage in, going back to him again and again. I wanted to read a short parable in Luke chapter 12. It's really inspiring to me. It shows me something about Jesus that I think is crazy. It's a core characteristic of who he is. I think it speaks a lot to the things we've been talking about, but I also think it sets us up in a great way for our next topic. Over the next few weeks, like Harold mentioned, we're going to be talking about the theme of serving one another. But before we can even talk about serving one another, we have to talk about the ways that God serves us. So in Luke chapter 12, turn there with me. In verse 35, this passage is so short yet so dense with theological truths. Verse 35. It says, "Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him." This parable starts with a call to be like servants who are prepared and ready to do anything that their master tells them. Only those who live without electricity know how hard it is to light a lamp in the middle of the dark. This calls us to be like servants who are not caught off guard, scrambling to get things together in the darkness while their master comes back, but who are eagerly waiting for his arrival and ready to roll when he comes back. If the parable were to end here, it would be an appropriate and thoughtful message. And it preaches really well. We could use the rest of our time talking about how important it is to be eager servants of God and living in tireless servants of him until he comes back. That message is true and right, but Jesus doesn't stop there in this particular parable. But before we get to that next part, there are two interesting details in this last verse. Kenneth Bailey, in his book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, points out an interesting difference in translation. In English translation, it has the servants waiting for their master who will return from the wedding banquet. Other versions across the centuries have often chosen to describe servants who are expecting the master who will withdraw from the banquet in order to come to them. Waiting is passive, like waiting for the bus. but expecting the movie to start projects a little bit of a different mood. There's an eagerness, maybe even an excitement that it implies. Furthermore, if the master returns, the reader assumes that the wedding banquet is over and that all the guests naturally just return home. But if the master withdraws from the banquet, it brings up the image of him slipping out while the banquet is still in progress. So if that's the case, why would the master slip out early from the wedding banquet? Maybe it was a sort of pop quiz, for his servants, making sure they were doing what they were supposed to do when he got there. Maybe he was just tired and wanted to turn in early. But the next couple of sentences tell us why. Verse 37, it says, "It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or toward daybreak." This turn of events would have been absolutely astonishing. The master's servants have been waiting loyally to serve him. But on arrival, he immediately goes into his bedroom, picks up a belt to tie up his wedding garment, and puts his servants at the table to serve them. And what does he serve them? Did the servants already have food prepared that he used to give them, or is it possible that he brought some of the food from the wedding banquet himself? Is it possible that in the middle of the wedding banquet, the master remembers his house servants and, filling a tray with the best of the lavish feast before him, he slips out, moves quickly to his private quarters in order that his friends might participate with him in the celebration and then serve them himself? He doesn't even send some waiter to bring them food. He goes himself, almost as if he missed them and wanted to hang out with them. Is there any culture anywhere in the world where this dramatic act is not a shock? Sure sounds a lot like something Jesus would do to me. When trying to describe the kind of master he is, Jesus uses a picture of a master lowering himself to become a servant. It echoes of Jesus' similar teachings when he says that the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life in service to others. Or when he compares himself to a good shepherd that wants to lay down his life for his sheep. We often talk a lot about we need to serve God. We need to serve God, which is good and right. But if we never let ourselves be served by God, we will find ourselves quickly burnt out. And I actually think it can be harder to let God serve you sometimes than it is to serve him. Just ask Peter, right? When he was noticeably uncomfortable, when Jesus tied a different belt, a towel, around his waist and stooped down to wash Peter's feet. Peter said he was willing to die for Jesus. But when it came time for Jesus to die for him, to wash his feet, he wanted no part of it. "You shall never wash my feet," said Peter. But remember what Jesus says? He says, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." So according to Jesus, a requirement for being in relationship with him is letting him serve you. Being a servant is at the very core of who Jesus is, of who God is. That one of his main desires in the universe is to serve us, to wash us, no matter how dirty. But why is that so hard for us? Because it's vulnerable. It is vulnerable to let yourself be served and loved by a being that doesn't have to. In the words of a pastor named Tyler Staton, he says, I can confidently say that the number one obstacle the modern person faces when it comes to prayer is an inability to receive the love of God. We struggle to believe in a God as powerful, good, knowable, and loving as the one Jesus introduces us to. God is love. It's who he is. The summary of his character boiled down to a single defining word. We buy that intellectually, but at a deeper level, somewhere in our emotions, in our bones, we don't trust it. According to Jesus, God wants to bless you. God wants to serve you. He doesn't have to, but he wants to. His predisposition towards you is generosity. He loves to give you what you need, and even sometimes what you want. But in order to have the presence of God, you're going to have to let yourself be served by God, which also means you're going to have to let him into the dirtiest parts of you. I think one of the best practices we have to experience God's washing in our lives is to open ourselves up to raw, gut-level honesty with him and others about what's really going on, the real emotions we're feeling, the weird thoughts we have, the doubts we have, and sin that has crept into our lives. This is our way of choosing to trust that God really feels about us the way he says he does. We understand his love most when we welcome him into our mess, shame, confusion, the ugly stuff, and ask him to help us clean it up. There's a word for this practice of gut level, secure, beautiful honesty, and that word is confession. I'm not sure how you feel about that word, but my hunch is that the word confession brings up different feelings in each of us. Maybe that word needs a little deconstructing for us too. Confession is an incredible invitation to freedom. But maybe in your life, it was relegated to a hollow religious rule that you were supposed to follow, or maybe even something that felt like it brought even more shame than healing. But confession is how we take God up on his power to heal us. It's how we turn to God, look him in the eye, and acknowledge his presence here with us. Not to judge, but to rescue. And I love this quote from this book, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. It talks about confession. It says, one of the biggest mistakes we've made in the modern church is to reimagine spiritual maturity as the need to confess less. The unspoken assumption is, as I ascend in relationship with God, I confess less because I have less to confess. True spiritual maturity, though, is the opposite. It's an ascension. It's not an ascension, it's an archaeological dig as we discover layer after layer of what was in us all along. Spiritual maturity means more confession, not less. Maturity is discovering the depths of my personal brand of fallenness and the depths to which God's grace has really penetrated even without me knowing it. The desperate need of our time is not for successful Christians, popular Christians, or winsome Christians. It's for deep Christians. And the only way to become a deep Christian is through the inner excavation called confession. The pathway of spiritual maturity is a descent, not an ascent. A maturing community is a confessing community, not a church without sin, but a church without secrets. Then it goes on. Says, we say we believe in grace. But confession is how we actually trust what we already believe in. The very parts of our stories we most want to edit or erase altogether become the very parts of our stories we'd never take back and never stop telling. That's the kind of author that God is. You know, God's the kind of author that, as my mom likes to say, takes your mess and makes it your message. Confession is one of those things where we open the door for God to come in and serve us and say to us, there is nothing that you could say that would make me not want to be in a relationship with you. David was a man, right, known after God's own heart. Why? Did he follow God perfectly? Nope. But he authored hundreds of pages of confessional prayers, the Psalms. He let himself be real before God. And I think it was in those moments that he felt God's love the most. You know, as we close, I want to finish with a story from this past week. This past Thursday, Michael Kadinsky invited me to a fundraising gala hosted by a local nonprofit called Frontline Response that deals with human trafficking and homelessness in the Atlanta area. The main speaker for the night was Tim Tebow, who, for those that don't know, is probably one of, if not, the greatest college football players ever, who played at the University of Florida. And Michael got us tickets for a meet and greet with him. And so we got to meet him and take a picture with him. And actually, I gave him a card I wrote just thanking him for being an inspiration to me as I was growing up. And I went on to tell him that because of influences like him, I was able to start my own nonprofit called JamQuest that's trying to help 1 billion kids around the world. And he said that was awesome, and we took a picture together. Then he came back to me, shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, let's go help 1 billion kids, which I just thought was awesome. During his speech that night at the event, he told a story about Mother Teresa. He told a story about a guy that was on a plane with Mother Teresa, and he was sitting next to her, which is crazy. He's like, wow, that's Mother Teresa. So he starts, talking to her and kind of like getting to know what she does and her story. And, as he talked to her, so the story goes, he just started getting impacted, and like just started just getting convicted. And so he says, man, I want to help. Can I help in some way? She's like, totally. So he writes a check for $200,000, and he gives it to her. And he's like, oh my gosh, thank you. This is going to be so helpful. It's going to help so many kids. Thank you so much. He said, yeah, it's no sweat. And then her face changed a little bit. And she handed it back to him. And she said, and he's like, what are you doing? No, it's fine, take it. And she said, true love means real sacrifice. True love means it's got to hurt a little bit. And so, of course, he's even more convicted, in that moment, and starts scrambling. And so the story goes, writes a check for $1.2 million. Oh, wow. And he hands it to her. And he says, now that hurts. Jesus' love was proven in this. Jesus says, I'm willing to sweat for you. He's so willing to serve us and love us that he sacrificed his own blood for you and me. He isn't afraid to get hurt for us. And I think this part of God's character is so important with what we've been talking about. The only way we can truly get through those moments when we're deconstructing is to remember and discover that Jesus wants to serve us even in those moments where we're questioning, doubting, and reevaluating. He wants to meet you where you're at, especially in your pain. And he's willing to get dirty and sweaty to meet you there. But also when we're reconstructing, the only thing that will empower us and anchor us as we go out into the world to serve others is the deep service and love of our Master, who says this on the same night that he washed Peter's feet, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. His sacrifice for us should motivate us to sacrifice for one another. To me, what we just did, taking communion together, brings all of that together. It's a time we take each week to recline at the table of Jesus, where he serves us with his own body and his own blood, reminding us that he is willing to endure anything to serve us. And in doing so, as we look around and take that together, it should overflow in motivation to serve one another. In a moment, Andy and Alyssa Pilcher are going to share with us why they decide every week to serve us, and at our services. And it's part of something we're going to be doing every week as we sit on this theme of serving one another together, where we're going to hear from different servants in our church on why they do what they do, which is going to be really cool. And I'm going to pray in a minute before they come up, but I wanted to offer 2 practices that could be helpful this week for us to experience God's service. One is just taking some quiet moments to reflect on how God has served you recently. And number 2 is to pray David's prayer in Psalm 139, where he just says, search me, God. Reveal any offensive way in me. And then listen. Listen for what he says. Take some time to get with a trusted friend and confess what he reveals to you in those moments. I love those Charles River bench in Boston moments. Those are moments to stop and look at our map, reflect on our lives, and acknowledge all the ways that our Master withdraws from his banquet and comes to serve you and me. Let's pray. Father, thank you for serving us. Thank you for being, that's not just an act that you're supposed to do, but it is your greatest honor and joy to come and serve us, Father. Thank you. That's at the very core of who you are. God, thank you that I know you're trying to serve us every day. It's not just once, but you, God, are trying to come meet us where we're at every day. Father, help us to see those moments. Help us to open ourselves up to those moments of being served by you, God, of feeling loved by you, of God, just being vulnerable there before you and letting you be the one to come in and heal some of those dirty parts. Father, we are so grateful that we serve a God that's not even primarily our relationship. It's us serving you, God, but it really starts with how you've sought after and serve us every day. I pray, God, you would give us the heart that you have, that Jesus has, to not only have us be washed by you, but then also to go and wash one another. Father, thank you for him. Thank you for this time together. Amen.